Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to our session around value migration. I'm Michael Jacobides, and I hold the Sir Donald Gordon Chair of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the London Business School. And what I would like to do is to share a few thoughts and some of the recent research in terms of value migration. Allow me to start with the banalities, with the things that we all know. So we all know that there is a lot of change that is happening in the structure of the sectors. You've heard that this morning. You've heard about the sectors that are converging, and obviously we've seen a huge amount of disintegration, things from financial services that used to be done and integrated banks being blown up and mediated by the capital markets, automobiles, or thinking about farmers or computers. The interesting thing, though, is that with this change come a lot of new players that are coming both from different sectors and from different parts of the world. If you think about the two major geopolitical changes, the emergence of China and India, to a large extent, they are the result of the vertical disintegration of the companies that used to have the software writing or the customer calls within their own countries, and through vertical disintegration, outsourced that to India and outsourced the production to China. So this is driving geopolitics, but also this is driving value. It is changing the rules of the game, and it is changing what drives success. You've also seen it by looking at the companies that have the biggest change in market capitalization. The hot companies of today, like Google and Facebook, are not companies that compete in a sector. They are the companies that are trying to redefine what the sector is about. And you see the reaction of concerned incumbents like Microsoft that is trying to leverage, sometimes buying fairly expensively, different companies like Skype, or absorbing parts of other companies like Nokia, trying to reposition themselves. Now, we know that, but what is it that can help us understand how value migrates? Well, let me share a bit of data. And what I will do is I will start with some of the images of the changes in market capitalization in an entire sector. There's going to be a geeky movie, and the geeky movie is a movie of how market cap changes hand. What you will see is the market capitalization of the entire ecosystem over time, and you will see who is able to make money. Not in an absolute term. This is the computing ecosystem. I'm not going to show you how the market cap of the entire computing ecosystem evolved. It grew, went from 400 billion to 1.7 trillion, then went down, then went up again. But what I will show you is how that was divided between the different types of players. So what do we see? Over here, we see the vertically integrated players. And unsurprisingly, Big Blue is a Big Blue. So IBM over here is about 40% of the market cap of the entire sector. Over here, you see the other vertically integrated players. You see players like DEC or Hewlett-Packard that also make computers. Over here, you see the vertically specialized players, which, when you put them together, make a computer. These are the semiconductors, electronic component manufacturers, computer system designers, the lot. And you can see different colors, again, being different firms. The biggest one being Texas Instruments, because we're speaking of the 1970s. White space means that you have market cap in that part of the sector, but not in the top 15. So lots of white space means that the smaller companies are having a bigger part of the value pie. And at the top, what you will see is the companies that supply to all. It is software, later it's going to be ISPs, and what I'm going to show you is the evolution of value from the late 1970s up until 2005. So between the early 1980s, IBM still manages to dominate. By 1983 or 1984, the other guys become important. IBM also is jumping to computer accessories, and you slowly see semiconductors as well as software, magenta, which is Microsoft, and brown, which is Intel, pushing them. And as this fragments, as people are obsessed and competing against each other, the vertically integrated guys are totally losing. Lots of white space, lots of new entry that's coming up, and you have huge players now, Microsoft and Intel, that dominate, and lots of white space. There are new segments that start emerging, like ISP, that attract value. By the early 2000s, there's almost no value in being a vertically integrated player, and by 2005, massive, massive redistribution of value. Now, this stuff matters, and it matters because it made 13 out of the 50 richest people in the world. It also matters because it changed the position and the standing of what used to be the global icons. What can we learn from that stuff? Well, the first lesson is that it doesn't really matter how good you are. It matters what you do. The problem of IBM, and also the problem of Apple of yesteryear, the very painful lesson that Steve Jobs learned and then applied it in his second go as a CEO, is that if you focus too much on yourself and your competitors, you're probably going to be missing the boat. You will be thinking about your own narrow segment. You're not going to be thinking about managing the dynamics of your ecosystem. We also see that value can shift around not only different offerings, different ways of approaching the customer, but around the value chain in remarkable ways that overwhelm what we're used to be looking at within a sector. And we also see that the way that you create and capture value changes over time. Now, if I was a true guru and I was not a business school professor that also did research, I'd probably stop there. I'd be showing this image the world over and saying, this is the way the world changes, and I'd have a couple of ad hoc stories. But reality is slightly more complicated, and we kind of like to poke our stories a little bit more here. So I started saying, okay, well, that is interesting, and I can certainly explain the changes that happen, but there are sectors that don't change. There are sectors where the incumbents are able to still retain the value. And I started looking at another sector that I know, which is the automobile sector. And it is interesting because if you start thinking about automobiles, there has been a heck of a lot of vertical disintegration. A very similar kind of process like the one that we saw in the computer segment, but you didn't see all these massive changes, and we kind of expected them. If you look at the late 1990s, it was the time of Visteon, the time of Delphi, the time of these great expectations about how these mega suppliers would change it. Bain had a report called The Dawn of the Mega Supplier, explaining how these new giant suppliers would essentially seize the day and take the rug from the hapless OEMs. People in MIT saying, oh, I start looking at the analogies, and it's going to be the same thing. And now to be a bit cheeky to our sponsors, Deloitte, the same thing is actually happening today in the electric car. We see the same hype that the electric car will start making cars look like the computers. So about 4 years ago in a meeting in Istanbul, one of the Deloitte consultants leading their automotive practice there said, look at the value chain of cars. It's going to change. It's going to become like the computer. And guess what? His next slide was showing how precisely the lessons from the computer would apply to the car. However, the story is a little bit different. Let me first tell you what the story is, and then we're going to do something slightly more interesting than storytelling. We're going to try to have a theory that explains change and explains stasis. But data first. So what am I looking here? I'm looking at the exact same thing, and I'm going to show you the car industry and the way the car industry has evolved. And what we are seeing is market capitalization. You will already notice a difference. And the difference is that unlike in computers, I don't have the vertically integrated guys and then the specialists on the side, because you can't quite put together a car in your garage in the same way that Michael Dell could put a computer together. And that's not by mistake. It's not that it's not technologically feasible, but there are other reasons, strategic reasons, for which this happened. To make it more exciting, I will also add different colors that kind of tell you where money is going. Magenta type colors, US, grayish colors, Japan, yellowish colors Europe. And what I will show you is how value is changing hands. You will see new segments emerging, segments that didn't exist because outsourcing had not advanced in this sector so much in the 1970s. And you will see how that is distributed between the different firms. So what's going on over here? Well, from the 1980s, you see that you've got the American companies that are starting to be challenged, Toyota taking the first place. You see lots of new segments emerging here, but still most of the value goes to the OEMs. You have some strugglers along the value chain, great migration. You have new players, especially in the outsourced services and the subcontracted production. You have, again, the Americans being battered, and you have a different geographic division of labor. By the 2000s, you see this greater variety in terms of the other players that are coming up and the new players. And by the mid-2000s, you see a fair amount of value migration. But the other thing that you see is that the OEMs were still able to capture the majority of the value. And now that takes us to slightly more serious thinking about strategy. What can explain both the migration of value and the ability of the incumbents to defend their turf so that we don't get too excited in terms of what may change in our competitive environment? We need to have some principles that can explain both, and that was the result of the study of the sectors that we had. Now, I will give you a couple of principles in terms of what changes and what doesn't. But in order to do that, I'll turn to another example. It's just before lunch. So allow me, if you don't mind, to illustrate these principles looking at wine. And I'll use the story of wine and who captures value in the ecosystem, in the value chain of wine production, to help us understand what's going on in computers and in cars. Now, if you think about a great bottle of Bordeaux, what names come to mind? It's a highly select audience. Don't pretend that you haven't tried your first growths. Let me see. Let me get some suggestions. Good Bordeaux? Lafitte, excellent. I think I heard Petrus. What was that, the other one? Margaux, absolutely. So if you think about that, you've got the iconic names of Petrus and Margaux, these wonderful bottles with the properties usually in some shape or form, or their insignia on the bottle. Now, if you think, though, about the end of your meal, and it's dessert wine time, and you think about a good bottle of port, what names would come to mind for a good bottle of port? Sandemans, Grahams, Taylors, Dow. That's kind of strange. If you think about it, French wines, French names. Portuguese wines, British names. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why it is. The main reason you see this difference is that you have different players in the value chain. Bordeaux are growers, the properties, and you can see them there. Port are shippers. The people who certified are shippers. And what does that tell us? It tells us in the very same product, you can have different people along the value chain, both certifying and keeping the value of this certification. And it's kind of interesting because it all started with this guy. Napoleon Bonaparte, you see, had a rather visceral dislike of the Brits, as a number of French do, and decided to wage war. Now, if you wage war, you don't have a nice claret. If you don't have claret, you need to go elsewhere. You go to Portugal. Your wines are going to be rotten by the time they reach England. You put a bit of cognac in order for that to make them a bit stronger, hence the fortified styles of the port that we still drink today. Now, what happened then is that the shippers started seeing that this was a very lucrative trade, and they were the ones that were starting to make the money. And at some stage, this guy lost the war. As they lost the war, they said, hurrah, now is our time to be the ones that will also dominate the Bordeaux trade. Now, the French, in an interesting early show of étatisme, realized that that was a losing proposition, because that would mean that they would shift the value outside the national boundaries. And they said, hang on a minute, we'll find a better way of doing it. And the funny thing is that the guy that finally settled the matter is this chap over here called Napoleon the Small, which is rather annoying when your uncle was small to begin with. But this guy, who was the French president, then emperor, then what, managed to take something that kind of existed but nobody took very seriously, which is the classification des grands crus classés. And then he said, look guys, we're going to have something that we will tell the world really describes it, because it's got to do with the terroir, it's got to do with exactly which commune your grapes are growing in, and by God, we're not going to change it. They only changed it once, and that was for a Rothschild wine, and you can understand that you want to be rather nice to one of your bankers. So other than this particular change, they said, whatever changes in the quality, we will not change the classification, because that will allow us to be the ones that are certifying it. And contrast that with the second biggest commodity after oil, coffee. Coffee growing in these wonderful lush parts of Ethiopia. And it is a fruit that has huge variance in terms of the particular seeds and where it is grown and the microclimate, and you have people in Ethiopia that really care about it, and the difference shows in the results. But unfortunately, they require aid to be able to continue their existence. Why? Because out of each pound that you spend on a Starbucks coffee, 1 penny is what goes to the people that grow coffee, for all the effort of people that are doing are trying to certify that. Why? Well, it has to do with the fact that there is no such grand cru, that it is the bottom end of the value chain that certifies and manages the relationship with the customer. Let me now go back to cars and computers. What happened? In computers, IBM unwittingly standardized itself out of existence. It started doing something that their engineers thought was very clever, because we're going to have something that we can mix and match and we will create great stuff. And they didn't understand that in the process, they lost their ability of creating the link to the customer. They arrogantly assumed that the link that they had with the corporate customer and the brand would live forever. Big mistake. And what happened is that Intel accidentally stumbled upon the Intel Inside campaign and then invested $3.4 billion to create the most impressive shift of value along the value chain and manage its relationships with Microsoft to create the stronghold in the computing ecosystem. If you think about other segments in there, like hard disk drive, which has one of the biggest rates of technological advance, no money at all. Now, in cars, there were many suppliers that were trying to do very similar things. But on the other hand, the OEMs were able to persist and to manage the experience and to keep the bonding with what it is that they offer. And interestingly, the short-term pain allowed them to do it. What was it? The fact that if something goes wrong in a car, it is the auto manufacturer that's legally liable. So they bear all the responsibility for any recall. They're not going to show their supply chain saying, don't ask me, Gov, that's his product. It is the car of the OEM. And although they hated it, it actually gave them a whip that would allow to be cracked when one of the suppliers would be out of terms. And it's interesting because it also tells you that in a value chain, no pain, no gain. And you can think about that with horse burgers. Now, if you think about horse burgers, the interesting thing is that they have got a value chain which is as complicated as the financial service value chain. You've got brokers who take shipments that then break them up, and being able to trace it all the way back to the abattoir is close to impossible. And of course, what Tesco's could have said, sorry, mate, but I was just buying meat. I couldn't have known that in this particular Romanian stable, they were not slaughtering only cows, but they decided to enhance it with a few dead horses. Now, they didn't do that, and it was critical that they didn't do that, because this way they will be able to keep the trust and the ownership of the relationship with the customer that allows them to continue being in the chain the ones that are most powerful. And think about the battles that the retailers are waging with the FMCGs right now for precisely this kind of stuff. So this is one of the principles. The principle is differentiability, how different you are along the value chain, not only in terms of your own components, where the value lies in the entire ecosystem. There's a second principle, and the second principle is replaceability, another multisyllable word. At some stage, perhaps I'll find a shorter way of calling it. Now, this as a principle is something that annoyed this political philosopher that is buried in Highgate in the name of Karl Marx about a century and a half ago. You see, Marx was rather annoyed that these dandies, the people having a wonderful life as capitalists in the mid to late 19th century, were having a grand time and wonderful revenues, while people working 18-hour days would not manage to make a living. And eventually he said, Eureka, I got it, I know what it is. What is it? Well, it's the structural theory of unemployment. It is the reserve army of the unemployed that depresses the amount that labor can keep, because everyone is looking over their shoulder saying, oh my God, I'm going to lose my position, someone else is going to get it, the price is going down, and capital becomes the bottleneck, becomes the scarce production along a complex production chain, and that's how it is able to attract value. Now, perhaps we don't agree with other parts of his analysis, but he certainly got the economics of that right. And it is interesting because that is what we see with companies that are able to extract value from their ecosystems. And how do they do that? They don't do that only by having millions of people along the value chain from which they make them compete. Some do. And if you think about the alliances that Google or Microsoft have, well, it so happens that it's one of them, and there are thousands of the others. I worked a few years ago with a guy from Microsoft, had an interesting title, Simon Brown. He was based in their Reading offices, and he was called Chief Field Evangelist. Now, a field evangelist is a title that had 1,400 people reporting to him, resources ring-fenced at the national level so that the local CEOs don't poach them or reduce his budget to keep them for their own P&L, and their objective was to ensure that the future would be Microsoft-friendly. Now, if you think about the way that you would do it, it doesn't take thousands. You can do it by having closed supply networks. What is it that made Toyota so effective? Its supply system. Why? Well, what it does is got tiers of suppliers. And in the first tier, it has usually 3 to 4 major suppliers. It uses Nippon Denso, it uses other strong firms. And it says, look, you're going to be in the top tier, but you're going to be compared with the other top tier firms. And be sure that you're going to be kicked out if you don't perform. And the first tier does it to the second tier, does it to the third tier. So in essence, you're able to extract the value by these closed hierarchical supply networks. What happened in computers? A very different story. You see, computers disintegrated, but not in this hierarchical structure. You had these separate segments: equipment, components, product design, assembly, operating system, which may look fun and fancy and democratic, but it also means that anyone can compete anywhere, and that the OEMs lost their ability to be calling the shots. So that stuff matters. And it's interesting because I started with these slides that said, are the cars moving the ways of the computer? Interestingly, the exact opposite is happening. Think about what Apple is doing. And think about the fact that behind Apple, you have a set of suppliers. And it's quite interesting digging a little bit deeper in the way that these guys do business. It isn't only that they are not vertically integrated at all and that your Apple devices, say, designed in California, manufactured in China. It is also that they manage their suppliers very carefully. So here's a report from Sanford Bernstein Research saying that our interviews with a number of suppliers suggest that Apple atomizes its supply chain to an unprecedented degree, breaking out component processing steps across multiple vendors, and that gives Apple inordinate control over the manufacturing process as if it were vertically integrated. So here's a funny thing. Rather than cars becoming like computers, computers are becoming like cars. And the world is more complicated, and it's kind of interesting because right now, as part of the tool work of strategy, we're starting to look at all these structural features, at whether you've got closed systems, whether you have open systems, where you use crowdsourcing, where is it that you want to use open or closed procurement structures. And if you think about Apple, it's got a large integral core, little use of open source, proprietary formats for complements, and a band of control around the user. And if you think about what the efficient challengers do, they don't only try to navigate there, they try to transform themselves, creating their own logic. So if you start mapping down the strategic design that Google has in terms of similar products, you see a very different structure with open source strategically put in particular areas, and many of them. You have complementers that design and make handsets. You've got the search engine replacing the store. It is that they fundamentally care about the customer, but also it is about the efficient design of the ecosystem, of the architecture, of the design of the way that you work with other firms. And it's interesting because, of course, it is not a strategy that can live forever. Think about what Google is doing, in particular in the mobile phone area. It understood that it was under threat. What was happening, it's under threat. The big telcos were starting to push it out. Vodafone was saying, I'm going to have my own search engines. I don't want you to be that strong. And they said, hang on a minute, I need a way in. I don't want to be excluded and only live on desktops, because that's not how the future is going to be. So what did it say? Hey, I'm Google. I'm your friend. I'm going to help create a nice collaborative game. And hey, it's Android. Don't pay me anything. It's going to be great. It's going to be free. I'm not going to take any royalties. We want to make the world a better place. And coincidentally, we're going to be the only search engine. We're going to take all the media revenue from there and try to squeeze anyone else. But we don't need to think about that right now. It's not all that important. The problem is that they didn't see it. Not only the device manufacturers didn't see it, but certainly the telcos didn't see it. But let me forget the telcos just for a moment. I'll return to them in a moment. What happened with the device manufacturers? Samsung originally said, sure, I'll play along. I'm going to be one of these happy companies that work in Android. And it grew and grew and grew. Now, the interesting thing with Samsung is that the more it grew, the more it started customizing the skin of its experience, the way that the Galaxy phones looked, so that people don't think about Android, but people think about Samsung. And guess what it did just now? It announced that it'll start having its own operating system. It told Google, I now have more than 40% of your market. We either discuss as partners and you stop pushing us there, or we're going to have this thread open for you. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that explains many of the changes that we see. Now, I borrowed that from an Oliver Wyman presentation of about last year, and shows you how Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are trying to position themselves in multi-business ways to control your experience. And obviously, Amazon's foray in mobile phones and in the operating system that will reside in them is going to be an important part of ensuring that they lock you in even deeper ways than they had before. So you start understanding that strategy is much more about managing your ecosystem. So what do I want you to remember from that? The differentiability and replaceability rule value migration, that you need both of them, that you fight the fight with alliances, with standards, with strategic design, and that if you focus on your sector as traditionally construed, you may be in grave danger, primarily because you've got hungry wolves that are starting to transform existing traditional sectors. In some settings, like cars, you may be able to use things like your legal liability to your advantage, but only if you're nimble enough to make that work. And in a Harvard Business Review that I published with my former Wharton colleague, John Paul McDuffie, we provide some advice both for entrants and for incumbents that want to protect their own turf. But in the interest of time, I'll just leave that for some later time, and you can take a look at the article if it's interesting. A couple more things, since I promised to speak about value migration more broadly. What else happens as sectors shift? Interestingly, and here we go to the subtler picture again, you have huge shifts in terms of the market capitalization, and you have much smaller changes in terms of the operating cash flow. If you were to design similar maps of where free cash flow exists in a sector, you'd get very different views. Why? First, because the cash flow looks at the past, market cap looks at the future. Second, because there's a heck of a lot of hype and lots of hot air in the market cap up until we figure out what's going on. And third, because people are starting to adjust their strategies. Now, the problem, of course, for existing companies is they can't say, oh, you know what, Gov, I don't need to worry about that too much because operating cash flow isn't changing. I'll educate the stock market. No. Why? Two reasons. Reason number one, it is because customers have fundamentally different expectations as these new alternatives emerge. It may not be a big part of the market. It changes how we price. It changes what people expect. It changes what you are compared to. So for the incumbent businesses, even small market shares of new business models have a disproportionate effect in their relative positioning and in their ability to price. We're seeing that in financial services, and I'll return to that in a moment. And also, firms face a new set of strategic dilemmas. If you are a traditional firm, what do you want to do? Will you be a player that will do this new stuff, or will you leverage your existing skills? And that's the interesting board-level discussions that I start seeing in some sectors. Let's go to one example. Think about what's happening to telcos that I mentioned. With this unbundling, we are realizing that telecommunications really consists of very different sectors. One is the transportation and infrastructure. The other is devices. The third is apps, content, and access. Now, in terms of the transportation and infrastructure, it is long-term capital expenses. You need to optimize all of your transmitters and the tech infrastructure and so on and so forth. It is a business that looks more like fixed income than equity. It grows with GDP. It's like a super tanker. And it might be okay if you say that this is a super tanker that's going to give you a nice steady state of revenue. You then have devices, very different, fully global, not local like the others, platform wars, and you also have apps and content with a huge amount of heterogeneity. The problem when you think about the companies that are there is that they are fundamentally confused. Most of the major telco operators are big tankers that want to pretend that they are speedboats. It's great when you attach speedboats to your tanker. You screw up your investors when you think that you're a speedboat. And I am seriously concerned that especially the major telcos are engaging in massive value destruction in the medium term by not realizing what they can do, what they can't do, and how to adjust in the new realities. The same thing that I've seen in financial services firms, where the question about these new ways of connecting to money, you may say, oh, that they're very small. All these wonderful things like the peer-to-peer lending, purposeful lending, all of that stuff might be only a small part of the total lending activity. But first, it changes the expectations of the people that interact with you. And second, and perhaps more important, it begs the question of what banks want to be. Should they be well-run utilities, or should they try to be equity players? If they try to pretend that they can do both, they will lead again to massive value destruction. So as the sector changes, our strategy should change as well. And the problem you see with existing firms is that they don't tend to think about this way. They don't say, hey, my sector changed, let me change it. Faced with an innovation, they do two things. They either freeze or they want to do exactly what the new guys are doing. Neither of them makes sense. The challenge is that they don't adjust their habits as the world changes. And that takes me to the final bit of what we have found, both in terms of research and from my executive work with companies, that fundamentally the real problem of strategic response, especially from incumbents, is organizational. It is that they cannot even leverage the collective knowledge that develops in there. We looked at that looking at success stories, at what works in terms of innovation. Success stories like Skype, like WhatsApp, in the financial services sector like Mint or Promontory. and then what the traditional integrated firms did. Nokia and Ovi's effort, Telefónica's purchase of Endemol, Vodafone's famous blunders in Live or 360, and of course, the mother of all value destructions in the sector, AOL, Time Warner. And what you see is a very common pattern when you shift from the strategy to the organization. What do you see? Well, what you see is that companies have a supply-side mentality. We heard it in the plenary a short while ago. They are looking at what they can offer rather than at what the customer really wants. They are trying to open the mind of the customer and stuff whatever service or product they have because they think it makes great sense. They are self-absorbed, and the problem is that they are vertically integrated in terms of trying to do everything themselves. You see that, and it's interesting, the exact same slide was a slide used in both a telco and a banking discussion recently. The pathologies are the same. They just have their own departments. They're not that good. They think they're good. They would like to do everything together. And they look at all of their internal organizational issues. And that's why entrepreneurs are now finding it easier to navigate this world. But even entrepreneurs need to have a good understanding of the principles and of the limitations of the existing firms as they try to identify the new sources of value. So how can we best position to succeed? It goes back to a few organizational issues. It goes back to understanding that success doesn't only come from the top. If you think about why Intel was able to morph itself from a memory company to a central processing unit company, it isn't the charismatic leadership of Andy Grove alone. It was the fact that middle managers were pushing for this new market, and the company eventually got it. And if you think about some of the other heroes that we said in terms of their own corporate practices, they are companies that are able to use, leverage, and generate knowledge from those that they employ. Strategies evolve when people push them forward. You need to use strategy as a tool for engagement. You need to start thinking about what is your narrative, what is your play script at the level of the corporate, at the level of the business unit, and have this as part of your conversation. We should not confuse strategy and resource allocation and the knives that go out at budget times and at objectives and how much money I'm going to come out. There is a huge confusion there, and we need to think about the non-yearly cycles, because when you integrate strategy with your yearly cycle, you really make it a political resource allocation challenge. You need to think about how you can motivate people and how to focus on the ecosystem, how to focus on the changes in the environment to be able to turn the attention from the internal stuff to the external stuff in terms of your customer and in terms of all the other people that could potentially be part of your ecosystem or who are part of your ecosystem. You need to ensure that the strategies that you had are successful in today's world. And to illustrate that, let me close with a story that comes from evolutionary biology. Now, if you think about evolution, the most important part of strategy is reproduction. Now, what do you see in your screen? You see the Australian jewel beetle. The Australian jewel beetle has been living in the Australian outback for a very long time, and it's had a fairly successful run. Now, the problem is that Australians came to Australia. With Australians came barbecues, with barbecues came beers. There's a bit of a problem because you see the main strategy that the male jewel beetle had is that a healthy female jewel beetle is big, round, brown, and shiny. And you may notice that there is an uncanny similarity between a beer bottle and a healthy female jewel beetle. And what you're seeing on your screens is a haplessly sexually aroused male jewel beetle trying to copulate with a beer bottle. Now, not only is this not going to give you a reproductory success, the problem is that other members of the ecosystem, termites, have figured out that when you see these bottles, lunch will soon arrive. So my closing thoughts are that what we should do is be the termites rather than the jewel beetles. Thank you very much. As we started about 3-4 minutes late, let's take a couple of questions if there are some. We've got a couple of mics in the back, so let me take any questions that you might have. If you want to raise your hand, there's one here in the back. Yes?
Hi. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on Windows Phone, because obviously it hasn't had a great run, and do you think it's a supply kind of side mentality that the competitor has, or is it more of a kind of a superficial brand perception problem?
Well, it's easy to do, I guess, what in the States you'd call the Monday morning quarterbacking. So when you know that things have not worked, you can say, ha, they should have known that. So I can start by doing that, and yes, I can tell you the ways in which it doesn't make sense. I think that what you have seen with Microsoft is the evolution of a firm that was quite entrepreneurial to a firm that is sales-driven. Having seen a little bit in terms of how they work, what you see is that there is a center in Redmond and then a very short-term sales-driven organization in a good part of the industry. So if I were to think about it as an external observer, what would I say? I don't think that they are putting their organization where their mouth is. I don't think that they are allowing some of that stuff to happen really. Some of their positions, some of the tactics that they have taken, including the deal with Skype and the deal with Nokia, make sense given where they are, but they could have done that more proactively earlier. And then the final thing is execution, because the failure of the Windows Phone isn't just a question, should we have it, do we need it, but it is, can we actually deliver? So again, I'd go back to the organizational issues and then figure out, what is it that we're doing wrong? And are we also running the risk of behaving too much like a vertically integrated monopolist? And I think that there is a bit more of that you would want. I don't think that from my engagement so far, I have been impressed by how open and porous Microsoft is, other than a very small and isolated pocket in Redmond. But let me leave it at that. Right, another question. I will take that into either beaten into submission or really hungry. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to speak with any one of you. Thank you.